Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Many motherless daughters or motherless mothers will have heard of Hope Edelman, who has written books to support bereaved women worldwide since many years. Her book Motherless Daughter has been written almost 30 years ago, and to this day it is being recommended to women, young or old, who are dealing with the loss of their mothers. More than that, I have had the chance to meet Hope through mutual connections more than a year ago, and I've been touched by her gentleness and her passion with which she serves her community of bereaved women. 12.5 years ago, I lost both my mother and my daughter within a time span of 4.5 months. I have experienced what it means having to learn to be a first-time mom with my newborn daughter at the same time as grieving her twin sister, and then my own mother who died just 4.5 months later. So this upcoming conversation is very dear to my heart. About this week's guest. Hope Edelman is the author of 8 nonfiction books, including the bestsellers Motherless Daughters and Motherless Mothers, and the AfterGrief, Finding Your Way Along the Long Arc of Loss. Her books have been published in 17 countries and 11 languages and have sold more than 1 million copies. Hope speaks at venues and conferences all over the world and has taught nonfiction writing for more than 25 years. Her articles and essays have been published widely, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Psychology Today, Parade, Real Simple, and CNN.com. She's a certified life coach with additional training in narrative therapy and trauma support services. In 2020, she was the recipient of the prestigious ADEC Community Educator Award. As the founder and CEO of motherlessdaughters.com, she creates and leads online support groups, in-person retreats, webinars, and Mother's Day programs that reach thousands of women each year. So I feel very privileged to be speaking with you, Hope, today, and for us to have this conversation here for the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast. Welcome, Hope.
Thank you, Natalie.
How are you today?
I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with you about a topic that is so important to both of us. So I would say I am prepared.
The pleasure is really mine. As I said, I feel very privileged. And why don't we start with you telling us and the listener a little bit about how your life story has unfolded in relation to grief, loss, and trauma?
Sure. Well, as a child, I experienced some big losses that affected my parents. And so I was able to observe what grief looked like and also what it didn't look like because some of it was hidden. I lost 2 grandparents and a great-grandparent, but my foundational loss, as I describe it, occurred when I was 17. I had just turned 17. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 15 and was diagnosed very late. It had already spread. And she lived in about another 1.5 years. So she died the summer before my final year of high school. And this was 1981. It was an era that was devoid of family grief services. Just the other day, my sister asked me, why didn't Mom die in hospice at home? And I said, because hospice didn't even exist in our community in 1981. The circumstances around her death were traumatic, and I'm doing deep EMDR now just around the 8 days right before she died.
Wow.
zeroing in on that. It's taken me all these years. Of course, this method didn't exist when I was in my 20s or 30s. I couldn't avail myself of it. But I went off to college a year later. I had two younger siblings. But all this time, I was looking for a book about what it meant to lose a mother when you were still a girl yourself. And all the books that existed at that time about losing a parent or losing a mom assumed that a woman would be in her 50s or 60s when it happened.
Yeah.
They were all for adults. And there wasn't anything in there that told me what it was going to be like to graduate high school without my mom, go to college without my mom, get married, have children. How would this feel in the future? Because it felt really bad and sad at the time. And I looked for that book for about 10 years.
Wow.
And never found it. But along the way, I met a few women, not a lot, a handful, but a few women who had also lost mothers when they were teenagers or younger. And we discovered we had a lot in common. And we started talking. So it was a good 10 years later, I was in graduate school for nonfiction writing, and I had some wonderful professors who had both lost mothers when they were young and encouraged me to try to write the book myself. And so I did. And that became Motherless Daughters. I make it sound easy. It wasn't. It was heart-wrenching to write.
Yeah.
It was a big process, to go out in the world and find publishers who trusted a first-time young author. But that book came out, the first edition, in 1994. And it was in interviewing women for that book. I interviewed about 90 women for Motherless Daughters in person. Always in person, not by phone or Zoom. Zoom didn't exist. But it was in meeting those other women that I found my highest form of healing, just in knowing that what I thought and felt could be validated, could be normalized, even if it wasn't normalized in the general population. And from there, I started doing support groups. This was in New York City in the 1990s. When I moved out to the West Coast, Los Angeles, I stopped doing intense Motherless Daughters work for a while because I became a mother and I was raising children of my own and teaching writing and still writing books. But about 10 years ago, I became certified as a life coach, specializing in grief and loss. And since then, because I really wanted to work one-on-one with women and also with groups. And so since then, I've been doing coaching, developing coaching activities and exercises, leading 4-day retreats, sometimes 1 or 2 day workshops, and weekly support calls, which developed during COVID lockdowns and became a lifeline for so many women, where they had a place once a week or twice a week if they wanted to do both calls, where they could sit in community with other women who had lost moms, who understood the fears and they reactivated grief that they were experiencing and the thought spirals that they were having as a result of that early trauma, because in most of them, that early loss, the grief, the trauma had gone unattended.
Yeah.
Either the adults around them did not bring the children to get services, or they didn't exist, like in my case. So that brings me right up to the present, where I'm doing this work right now. And the internet and Zoom has made it possible for me to work with women all over the world. We have a weekly call on Thursdays. There might be women from 9 or 11 countries on that call together. And the common denominator is that they all lost mothers when they were young.
So when you say they lost mother when they were young, I heard you speak about this before, but I want our listeners to be able to understand the different ages of people losing their moms and what effect it might have on them under different ages. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, because developmental trauma is so important, and the type of trauma that you'll experience depends on your stage of development. We find that the most important identifying factor to these women when they meet each other, the one that they want to put out there, with their name, is how old they were when their mother died. They want to meet other women who were the same age when their mother died. There's this intuitive sense that those are my people. They will be the ones who understand what it was like to get my period without my mom, to go through high school without my mom, to get my first job without my mom. So I think of young as anything below age 30. Our services concentrate on women who were children and teenagers because, but we also provide retreats and welcome people onto the calls who lost mothers in their 20s. And we recently started a third call for adult women who have mother loss in the past 2 years to work with the acute grief phase and help them, support them through that. Because again, a daughter losing a mother feels like she has a very specific experience and wants to be with other women who can understand that. But because if you were 18 or under, you were most likely and almost definitely dependent on the adults around you to help you process this loss, to find support resources for you. Whereas someone in their 20s might be able to avail themselves of those resources. We tend to work with majority women who were 18 and under when their mothers died. And also that's important because we know that adverse childhood experiences up to the age of 18 have long-lasting effects on a child's brain development and on their nervous system regulation. Now, that's not to say that a woman who's 23 when her mother died hasn't faced hardships, and she may have had earlier hardships before her mother died, but we find the most profound and long-lasting effects of mother loss and the most difficulties occur in those who were 18 and under because of the developmental trauma and the dependence on adults around them, and also because all the research points to what happens after a mother dies if you are still a dependent child living at home. What happens after a mother dies can have as much effect on the child, and sometimes even more, than the loss itself.
Wow.
If they are in a household where they're neglected or abused or their feelings are dismissed, or they bounce around from relative to relative, or there's any number of adversities that could occur after a mother dies. A surviving caregiver may be distant, they may be an alcoholic, there may be substance use or abuse. All of that matters a great deal, because then that child has not just lost their mom, but any sense of security and safety in the world.
Yeah. So what you just said about having to find or wanting to find people who have experienced similar or the same loss as you had, I can echo that from my experience of my first book writing and interviewing grieving parents. And it reminded me of what you said about your interviews for the first book for Motherless Daughters, where people find that if they meet people that have had the same kind of loss or the same time of the loss, they can speak freely about what they've experienced and feel, okay, you get me, you understand where I'm coming from. In terms of your experience with different ages, I'm really interested, because what comes to mind is also the clients or the people that I have spoken to either for the podcast or my clients who have had the loss of a mother at different ages. Now, you mentioned below the age of 18 as a bracket, sort of. But what would you say, just for someone listening, what would you say, how is that if a young child, let's say below 10, loses their mother versus, let's say, a younger teenager would lose their mother? I mean, there's always a different developmental stage, as we're aware of. But from your experience speaking to those women, what do you see? What kind of commonalities do you see or differences?
We could do an entire podcast or two just on this, Natalie. And, I'm reluctant to speak in broad generalizations because everyone's story is so radically unique. Mm-hmm. And you can have two siblings who have the same experience and walk away with different takeaways and different lingering effects or not. But I'll try in the spirit of answering this question to give some some generalizations. What I find is that, well, let's talk about women who were very, very young when their mothers died and maybe have no conscious memories of her. There's also something called childhood amnesia, where we naturally start losing early memories between the ages of 5 and 7, whether our parents have survived or not. So the women who were really young and have few or no memories of their mom carry, I think, an additional wound of feeling a lack of connection to her. And a lot of the work that we do at the 4-day Motherless Daughters retreats is helping these women reconnect with their mothers. Even the older ones may have experienced a disconnect with their mom. The relationship went to a certain point and just stopped. And then very often, more frequently than anyone wants to really admit or understand, a family will stop talking about a mother after she dies. It's too painful, or a stepmother comes in, or a new partner. And the children are left being the only ones holding the stories of their time with their mother and the love for her. And over time, they just learn not to talk about her as well. So we do exercises with women to help them reconnect with their moms. We see that certainly among the younger folks. The quality of caregiving that they receive, like under age 12, matters a lot at that time. That's a continuation of the loss. Also, the way a mom died and your birth order in the family, all these things matter a lot. The degree of responsibility you have to take for yourself or others. I mean, I've heard numerous stories of 11-year-old kids who have to step in and start cooking dinner for their younger siblings.
Yeah.
It's too much responsibility at too young an age. We've found a connection between that and imposter syndrome as adults, feeling that I'm not capable of being an adult because they were 11 years old and had that feeling, whether it was conscious or not, they really weren't old enough to be doing what they were doing. Absolutely. So that can have an effect on a daughter. The last thing I'll say about under age 12 is that these kids are still developing an understanding of what death is. They're not cognitively or emotionally mature to really get it until around 10, 11, 12, depends on the child. Everyone develops differently, but you need abstract thinking to really understand not just what happened, but what this is likely to mean for your future. So a 6-year-old child, for example, whose mom dies may naturally be thinking, who's going to pick me up from school every day now? Who's going to braid my hair in the morning? Who's going to pack my lunch bag? These are their concerns. Whereas a 12-year-old would be able to think, oh my gosh, what is this going to mean for the rest of my life? My mom's not going to be here for my high school graduation. My mom's not going to be here if I become a mother one day. So that's a big difference because those years, 7 to 11 are so important for brain and emotional development. The youngest children may not even understand what death is. To develop a fully adult understanding of death, which is that it is irreversible, meaning she doesn't come back. It's inevitable, meaning it happens to everyone, which brings up a lot of fear for the surviving caregiver and what might happen to them and leave a child alone and unprotected. And it's universal, which means it happens to everyone, which creates an existential crisis in a child because now they know it could happen to them too. So all of that is developing really between ages about 5 and 11 or 12. And what adults don't always understand, certainly didn't in the past, is that a child processes grief and loss over the course of their entire childhood. What a 5-year-old understands is really different from what a 9-year-old can understand. And someone really needs to be there to revisit with that 9-year-old the circumstances around a mom's death, assess how much they understand, how they're taking it in, how it makes them feel. And then again at 12 and again at 18, or 17, how does it feel to be going out into the world as an adult now without your mom? What do you understand now about her death that maybe you didn't understand before? And this is true throughout the course of a daughter's entire life, but very much up until the age 18. and this, I talk about this quite a bit in the AfterGrief, is that the facts of a death remain the same. I mean, I will tell you, my mother will always have died of breast cancer in 1981 when she was 42 and I was 17. Those are immutable facts. I can't change them as much as I'd like to. But how I have perceived those facts and what they've meant to me have meant very different things at different ages. When I was a teenager, I was confused and angry because, and this is a side story, but my mother and the children weren't told how sick she was or that she was dying. So I had a lot of feelings around that. So then in my 20s, when I started working on Motherless Daughters and meeting other women and interviewing my mother's friends and learning more about her, I had a very different perspective on what had happened. First of all, I realized I was not the only daughter that this, had happened to. Makes me sound like a victim. I don't like using that language, but I was the only daughter who'd had that set of events occur. I wasn't. When I met other women, I realized that. And my mother's best friend also gave me perspectives on my mother and my father that I hadn't considered before because I wasn't adult enough to know them. I saw my mother's death very differently when I became a mother a few years later and understood not just what I had lost, but what she had lost now in not getting to know her grandchildren and what my daughter was losing by not having a maternal grandmother. And then once again, I saw things very, very differently when I turned 42 and past the age my mother was when she died and realized how incredibly young she was and how scary it must have been to think about leaving her children. So I have processed and reprocessed this loss at different inflection points over my life. And children need help doing that when they're young, and also be held and supported in knowing it's okay if this continues to happen through your adulthood. In fact, that is normative, despite what the people around you are going to say about grief, despite the people around you who are going to say, really, it was 20 years ago and you're not over it yet? No, because you need to reprocess it at different points in your life. And it is excellent to have support at that time, whether it's professional or from the community of like-minded others.
I'm so grateful that you said that and the way you described it about having to reprocess it at different times of our lives, because I can see it again and again how these myths and conversations that happen in the community or in society in general influence each and everyone to think, I should be over it by now. Why isn't it better? Why does it still hurt? Or why does it hurt again? And the way you describe that makes so much sense for people to say, well, no, it's different at each milestone or age where you are. You look at it with different eyes. So in my case, my mother died when I was 42, and I just had become a mother myself and a bereaved mother at the same time. And it came unexpected. My mother died from suicide and following depression. But I reflect back at that point of where I was in my life and how much I also wanted my mother to be there for myself in asking her questions about mothering, as well as for my daughters, or for my daughter, my surviving daughter. And looking back at it now from years past, I still have very vivid dreams of my mother. She's still there very clearly in my living at night, and I have conversations with her. And I always know in my dreams she's not alive, but she's there to live something, and it's interesting to have that connection with her. So if you're looking back with your vastness of knowledge, both personal and professional, beside the fact of writing the book and talking to all these women that you've interviewed, what would you say has helped you in the different places in your life to process the loss of your mother?
Well, writing about it has helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I have put a lot of my thoughts into my book. But that's an intellectual exercise. I think I've needed to tap into, of course, the emotional part of it, which is talking about it with trusted friends. I am blessed to have a younger sister I am very close with. And even though we never talked about my mom, for about the first 10 years after she died, we now speak about it, our family, early family life, very, very openly. So we can talk to each other when that happens, when that comes up. Therapy, EMDR now is kicking my butt, but in the best way possible. It's really, getting down there into target points. We've taken the 8 days before my mother died and brought them down to a period of about 3 hours. And then we brought it down to a period of 2 minutes. That changed my beliefs about myself in the world and created messages that I've carried forward my whole life. So that's been a remarkable journey. And I think, I want to say working with other women, helping other women heal, but being in community with them has been the single most important aspect of my healing, whether it's as a coach or just as one of them sitting around having a conversation. I've developed some very close friendships in the Motherless Daughters community. And Sunday night, we're doing a girls' sleepover with 3 of us, and we're just going to be talking about our own experiences. I'm not there as the expert. I'm there as one of the girls. And I find that enormously supportive and healing, because what happens when we get together is we discover that how many of the choices that we've made have stemmed from that early trauma, the relational trauma, the developmental trauma, which I think of as 2, different categories, and we can talk about that. But how many of the decisions we've made in our lives since then have emanated from those early events? Mainly because, and I think this is true for all human beings, but true for different reasons in this population, which is that we are all trying to make choices to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah.
And what safety means to a child who's lost a parent is bound to be different than what safety means to someone who grew up with 2 parents in a financially unstable household, right? That their definition of safe might be something different. Someone who grew up in poverty may only feel safe, if they have security, a secure job and money in the bank. Someone who lost a parent when they were young often will feel safe and secure when they have relationships that are long lasting and people they feel they can depend on. So that's a different vision of what safety involves. But we realize how many choices we've made that have, come out of that quest to stay safe and not be hurt and not have another big loss. And of course, many of us learn we can't control that. That's not up to us. But we try.
Yeah. Yeah, the habit is still there. The survival mechanism is there. It's fascinating. It just reminded me of the places in which I have made decisions or taken things on as a way to avoid or to prepare myself in a false attempt. Like just yesterday, my daughter didn't come home at the usual time, and I heard myself say to my partner, in those moments, I always think she just died.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That is the kind of catastrophic thinking that comes from a sense of what's called perceived vulnerability much of the time, because a bad thing happened to us once. You lost a mom to suicide suddenly. Sounds like perhaps without any warning. And so who says that someone couldn't be taken from you suddenly without warning again? No one. There's no, board of arbitration that says that will never happen again. We live now with the horrible knowledge that could happen at any moment. What I think the true meaning of resilience is in a population that has suffered a traumatic or profound loss is living with that knowledge that such a thing could happen again every day, and yet finding the hope and the determination and the joy to live our lives despite that knowledge. That to me is resilience, to wake up every morning and place hope in a good day, where such a thing won't happen, even while we know that it could.
And you just said the word hope, and I don't know if you know, but the middle name of my daughter who died is Hope. And so this came serendipitously. So when I was pregnant with the twins, my husband at the time said, why don't we pick 2 angel cards? And he's not the angel card type, so I was a bit surprised when he made that suggestion. So we picked 2 cards as a name for each of the babies, because when you have twins, they're always called twin A, B, or 1 and 2, and we were fed up with that non-personalized name, and we didn't have names yet. So we chose 2 cards, and the first one was Hope, and the second one was Passion. So that became our names as in utero. And when they were born, the people around us said, well, you can't just leave those names out. What do you do with those names? We had picked out different names first and middle names. So we were wondering, what are we going to do with that? And so it became the middle name of both of our daughters. So the middle name of my younger twin daughter who died is Hope. And so your name as well, Hope. And one of the things for me as well was always, how do I keep hope in the face of losing hope? Because in my case, it was like what you were talking about, resilience. I didn't feel I had any hope or any ember of resilience for a long time. But looking back to that moment, I can see the ember was always there. It just needed one step at a time to then become bigger and bigger and bigger.
I think hope is a conscious choice. It is not something that just happens to us. Well, that's not true. I mean, maybe some people have the temperament that always bends in that direction. But many of the people I've met who've been shaped by an early loss feel that their nervous system and their psychic structure, their worldview bends in the direction of this could happen again. What can I do to keep this from happening again? I do find, however, that the longer we live, those of us who are lucky enough, fortunate enough, to live long lives, as our mothers didn't, because there's always the fear in this population that we will die at the same age as our mothers and not live beyond. And we can talk about that quite a bit. It's a very significant transition in this population. Mm-hmm. But for those who do live beyond it, I think we create or we develop a learned resilience, for those of us who don't experience another tragedy. And again, I want to acknowledge that some do, and that is difficult, of course. But those who don't often reach a point where they say, well, all these bad things that I was so afraid of didn't happen. And now I'm learning how to trust. It is a trust issue very much. Hope and trust are really important, are really interlinked. Mm-hmm. Now I can trust that they probably won't. But oh gosh, all those years I spent trying to guard against something that never happened. I wish I could have those years back. So when I work with the younger women, I'm really interested in helping them develop or rediscover some trust in the world so that they don't spend those 20 or 30 years trying to guard against something that's unlikely to happen. And if it does, to believe that they have the ability to survive it. And that's the other part of that definition of resilience that I was talking about, was the ability to get up every morning knowing that a terrible random thing can happen and still putting the most and getting the most joy as possible out of every day, because you know that if the worst thing happens again, and it could, you will survive it because you did before.
So I'm curious, you mentioned that before. You said you're teaching those young people to find hope or resilience again, to believe in the good things that that can happen, and not just wish for the bad things not to happen. How do you do that? Like I've asked myself that. How do I not always think the worst can happen, like my daughter is dead because she didn't come home at the time that she normally would come home.
Well, I don't know that we can stop ourselves from having thoughts, except, to have enough experiences of times when that doesn't happen. And then maybe we start thinking, oh, this will be like last time, where there's traffic on the way back from school and she's just going to be late. So I think that's one way that we can guard against catastrophic thinking. I think it's also helpful to learn techniques for regulating the nervous system, because what happens is that when we go to that space, and mindfulness meditation is so good for this too, we want to be able to recognize that's a thought, that's not reality. That's a thought that comes from my past experience, and let it go. Instead of letting it really, dig into the nervous system and let the nervous system, start getting activated and going into states of hyperarousal or hypoarousal. What can we do to calm the nervous system back down to baseline so that we can have that awareness? This is just a thought, and I know where it's coming from, and I can let it go. Also, one of the beauties of the work that we do on the weekly calls and at the retreats is that they are intergenerational. And the young women hear the older women say what I just said to you. Yeah. I spent 30 years worried that something was going to happen and making choices to keep it from happening. And now I wish I could have those years back. And those girls the younger girls, they take that to heart.
Yeah,
they think,
absolutely.
I want to spend 30 years trying to control my environment so nothing goes wrong, because here are women telling me that by doing that, I'm going to miss out on some things. And I don't want to miss out on things, because one thing that women who lose their moms young do, one common denominator is this incredible thirst to have a full and meaningful life, because they live with the fear that, or the awareness that they could die young, and they want to make the most of the time that they have here. The intergenerational conversation is an interaction, I think, is very, very helpful and influential in that regard.
I'm reminded of other podcast guests who shared exactly that experience of speaking to someone who knows because they have been there. So then whatever they're saying is so much more meaningful because they speak from the same place, but with years of experience. And when you were saying about worrying for nothing, hopefully, to happen, I'm reminded of the percentage that I've heard somewhere, which I don't know the data where it came from, but it was so meaningful to me to hear that. I think it's 85% of the things we worry about never happen. And then it's either 7 or 8% of the two other, which doesn't really matter because it's about the same. So 7 or 8% of them we don't have any control over, and 7 or 8% actually do happen. So I think it's the 93% of the time we worry for things that either never happen or we don't have any control over. So that's about the percentage of wasting time that we can do or avoid. And I think what you were saying about nervous system regulation, that's part of the work that I'm doing with clients, always to say, well, we need to take care of ourselves the same way we take care of our children, but we need to take care of our nervous system as if it's the part that needs the most attention, because which is often very dysregulated on a regular basis after trauma. And to bring that dysregulated state down to a little bit less dysregulation or less overwhelm with time, like with techniques as EMDR or with mindfulness or with polyvagal theory exercises, that is really, really important. That is like taking care of your body the same way as you do by exercising or by showering every day, by brushing your teeth. This is like maintenance work, especially for a trauma-induced system that doesn't know how to regulate in a way that an untraumatized nervous system does.
Absolutely. And, I just remembered something that we tell the younger women when they come, because they now have access to all of these tools. I mean, if you had said polyvagal theory in 1988 or EMDR even in 1992, no one would have known what that was. But now all these methodologies and resources are available. And we talk about them at our retreats. So sometimes one of the younger women, like in their 20s, will say, well, I want to come to this retreat because I want to know what it's going to be like for me in 20 years or 30 years. And they do meet women who can function as that kind of older sister or role models. And the women all stay in touch usually after their 4 days together and continue to support each other. But what we say is, it'll be really helpful for you to see how, women, to meet women who are further down this path. But we also want to let you know that your path is going to be different because you're here in your 20s.
Mm.
And if they'd been here in their 20s, their path may have been different as well. So please come, to learn, but also to be aware that you're making a choice for yourself now that is going to ideally, or hopefully, change some of the things that these women have really struggled with over the years. And the older women come because it is so gratifying for them to be able to pass this knowledge down to the younger women and say, here's what I did, and here's what I didn't do, and here's what I wish I'd done differently. And they feel like they're helping mentoring those younger women along. So it works really beautifully.
And all of those things that you've spoken about, as listeners already know, the links will be in the show notes. And I really recommend that you look out for people who have lost their mothers, as well as if you have been experiencing mother loss or dealing with a motherless mother. There's so many resources that Hope has on offer. So I can only highly recommend it. So if we were to round this up with, what would be one thing that you wish you would have loved to know at the beginning of your journey after your mother passed, what would that be?
I would have liked to have known that this was going to be a lifelong journey, but that it didn't have to be a lifelong struggle. Because in the beginning, it feels like such a struggle. And you don't want to even entertain the idea that this is going to be a lifelong process, because you don't know how it's going to change and grow, and that some beautiful things can and often do come out of it. So I was really trying to rush whatever I thought the process was when I was younger so I could get past it and into the fun part of life. That's how I thought when I was 19, 20. But I knew that the path that I had been on as a developing female had been derailed by the death of my mother. And now I was on some other path and I didn't know what it was going to be. And I kept trying to get back to that path I'd started on. And I didn't understand that that wasn't going to be ever fully possible. It took me a while to figure that out. But what I really didn't understand, profound loss, because it takes time to realize this, is that my mom's death set in motion a chain of events that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And in that chain of events, and the series of cause and effect relationships that developed over time, I was eventually led to some really wonderful things that I really don't think would have happened otherwise. Had I not written a book and started a nonprofit and then rented office space from two guys in New York City, I would never have met the man who became my husband. And if I hadn't met him, I never would have had the two daughters that I have, who are the lights of my life. And so I can say, if my mother hadn't died, these two girls, these two human beings, women, would not exist in the world today in the same way that they do. And so what we talk about at Motherless Daughters is we are not inviting you to trace the chain of events till you get to something good so that you can feel like it's a good thing that your mom died or that it's okay that your mom died. We're not trying to diminish the pain or take away the story of hardship. What we're doing, and this is narrative therapy based, is helping you create an alternate preferred narrative.
Exactly.
That stems from the same set of events, but that you can carry side by side with the story of loss and sadness to balance it out and acknowledge that you have a rich, full life that's full of stories, and that this story did lead to some happiness in your life. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're happy your mom died or that you're glad she's not here. Of course, it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that we can acknowledge that good things can come out of tragedy.
I think I should not add anything because that was so beautifully said. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hope, for all the wisdom that you've shared with us. This has been a wonderfully rich conversation for me personally, for me with the people in mind that I have, and I'm absolutely sure for my listeners. But before we finish, we always go through the rapid fire questions. So just a couple of questions. Would it be okay to do that now?
Absolutely.
So grieving and trauma means?
Pain and also the potential for later joy.
And healing means?
Feeling whole again, whatever that means to you.
And what have you learned about yourself in the light of the loss of your mother and the trauma that occurred in relation to that?
That I'm capable of handling much more than I think I am.
And what would be one thing you wish people knew about that kind of loss and trauma?
How much solace can be found in finding a community of others who've experienced a similar loss.
And so we talked about a lot of things that came out of or came after the loss of your mother. But if there would be one specific thing that has changed that you want to point out here since the loss of your mother and the trauma that you wouldn't want to miss, what would that be?
The opportunity to find a profession that helps so many people and honors my mother at the same time, because it helps me feel that her death had meaning.
That's touching. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all that you shared and how you show up with, as I mentioned at the beginning, as what I see in you, that gentleness and fierceness for the support of the people in your community. Thank you, Hope.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I also had wanted to ask you how much of your audience is UK and EU based, and how much of it is international, do you know?
I can look it up. I can see who listens to the podcast. Is there something specific you'd like to say to them from wherever they are?
Well, I wanted to let them know that we are now developing programming that is more UK and EU friendly, because we know that the women there want to participate. Our programming at the moment is all in English at the moment, but on Thursdays, we have a weekly call that is evening in the UK and EU that any woman who's lost a mother is welcome to join. And that's the international call. And we're doing our first 4-day retreat in the UK in September. And there's still plenty of time to sign up for anyone who'd like to come. And we do expect women to come from Europe and around the UK as well, around Britain. So we're setting that up so that, because women have flown from Germany, from Denmark, from Iceland, from Scotland, all the way to the US to do the retreats. And so we're trying to make it a little easier on them. And we will be pretty soon starting the first step of a peer training program so that women can lead 12-week Motherless Daughters support circles in their hometowns all over the world. And we're hoping that there will be women from all over the world who want to participate so they can help spread the word and, keep this work going for longer than I can continue doing it, because it's so important.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. I guess that all of those links can be also found on the website that is going to be linked in the show notes. And
just motherlessdaughters.com.
Exactly. And also with Mother's Day upcoming, please go and check out Hope's website for the events that are coming up. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. and remember to keep reading. I promise it will get easier.